Now we start. Oh yeah. So, Yost, I can't get these to turn into letters. It just stays a circle. Duh. Thank you to ATypI for having me be on the stage, and thank you all for coming back from lunch on a Saturday. Oh yeah. Okay, like that. There we go. Thanks. So the title of this talk, Muster Hundreds, comes from a specimen book by Wells and Webb, a New York manufacturing firm from 1840. And the title is, of course, what you've read in the book, Muster Hundreds Towards a People's History of American Wood Type, but I found that's a little dry, and after seeing some presentations yesterday, maybe got me thinking, and so I think it should actually be towards a telling of a few people's stories that worked at a particular company based in Connecticut, producing wood type for a multinational market during the 19th century. I think that's maybe a little bit more what I'm actually going to get to. And then after Tom Mulaney's talk yesterday, I'm going to take the liberty of paraphrasing him, but I'm no longer going to refer to wood type companies. I think I'm just going to start saying mechanized xylographic inscription industry, because that sounds way cooler. That's my housekeeping. Now I'm ready. This talk is as much about talking about things that I've found and how I'm putting them together as it is how I'm going about finding them. And so the process becomes important, mostly because this is an ongoing project, and I suspect I've got some job security in that it will take a while to finish this. But this is a bit of my brain thinking of how things are connected, looking at specimen books and finding information there, finding company information and finding there, and bringing it all together. And the ultimate goal is to begin to put names to people that actually designed and made wood type in the 19th century. So the time period that I'm talking about, wood type, as you all know, was invented, or the process for its mechanical production was invented in 1827 in the United States by Darius Wells. In 1834, it's combined with the router, or the router is combined with the pantograph, and so the router pantograph becomes the main means of mass production for wood type. It wasn't until about 30 years later that it actually takes hold in the United States. It was important to the jobbing printing industry, but not until after the American Civil War did it really kind of, I don't want to say catch on fire, that would be the wrong metaphor. It really caught hold. And it lasts for a period up until the late 1890s, early 1910s. And sort of poetically, we can say that it coincides with the adoption of the electric sign or the neon. Either one. It's poetic more than factual, but it roughly gives a timeline for what we're looking at. So the things that I'm going to be doing, I'm going to show you some indexing that I'm doing with type specimen books, how I'm using that information to build a descriptive bibliography of wood type specimens made in the 19th century, and identify, use those printed materials to identify manufacturers. So A.F. Johnson in 1966 says, "The discovery of hitherto unknown specimens has thrown a flood of light on particular designs." And this is fairly pertinent because most of the wood type we find, the really fantastical stuff, tends to only show up in specimen books. They were sales catalogs that the manufacturers used to try and promote their material and kind of get people to buy things, but there's a vastly larger variety in the specimen record than there is in the actual printed record. So specimen books tend to be a fine primary resource. It shows the range of styles that were available, that were being produced, all kinds of variety, size being the main side effect of working in wood. And then there's also secondary material in the specimens that are also useful, that tend to point back to company histories or things that were going on at the time that kind of anchor them in a time and a place. This particular specimen is the inside front cover of a specimen book from Hamilton in 1896. After the Chicago Exposition, there were whistles that had been used to chime out the time at the Columbian Exposition. James Hamilton liked it so much that he bought them and brought them back to the factory. And what they say is that he brought it back to the factory to produce inspiring music to call the workers to work. Those may or may not have still been at the factory or in Two Rivers when it was demolished 2 years ago. We're unclear as to whether they made it into the 20th century or not. But we always have this fine memory. In looking at all the specimen books, Rob Roy Kelly is kind of the touchstone to that. His book, the 1969 American Wood Type, is sort of the primary text, seriously out of date, but still the primary text. And in it, he catalogs 70 American wood type specimens from various manufacturers in several collections in the U.S. The work that I've been doing is to expand this and find them at other libraries and collections around the country. Right now, I'm focused on American wood type, but the list is now around 175. So I'm finding more and more material, and as I promote that I'm finding more material, I tend to find more material, and people are very helpful with that. So if you know about anything, let me know. One of the things that the specimen books do also is clearly indicate what kind of manufacturer stamp the manufacturer was using on their letter to sort of stamp, let everyone know that this was their object, their artifact. In the US, manufacturers stamped the capital A, typically on the side. And so with the specimen record, we're able to triangulate and pretty clearly tell what stamp was being used when. And that's very helpful because companies tended to move around and get bought out by other companies. And so it gives us a fairly clear reference to when we're actually looking at the physical objects, the wood type itself. So here's some more stamps. Wells early on was using the bottom or the foot of the block. He gave that up. And this is an accounting of most of the known American manufacturers and their stamps. So it's a good tool to begin to identify. So this next step is naming owners, finding company histories, figuring out physical locations, and that finding a physical location is really critical then to start finding the employees or the actual people that were actually doing the work. I was looking for a really great quote to go here. Somebody needs to come up with a great one. This is just my filler for now, but it gets really complicated because companies change names and then they would buy each other and change their names and then move and change their names. So it's hard to track down. But someday there'll be a great quote there that we could use instead. Finding where the manufacturers are begins to help us look at secondary materials to help in the search. Here's a distribution of different American manufacturers. They were mostly concentrated on the East Coast, in New York and in Connecticut, just outside of New York City. But then as the century went on, they moved west. And finally, the farthest west on your left. Whatever, is in Wisconsin, Two Rivers, Wisconsin, where Hamilton is located and where the Hamilton Wood Type and Printing Museum is now located. One of the best streets in America. It exists, it really does. In a little town in Connecticut, Windham, Connecticut. It is where Edwin Allen started his wood type manufacturing. In 1837, he ran the factory until 1852 when he sold out his concern to John Cooley, who moved it to New York City. The factory was used for different purposes during the Civil War, and then Charles Tubbs, who I'll talk about a little later, moved into the factory in 1879 and started production again until about 1904 when the company was sold and moved out to Michigan. That picture there is from 1910 when the factory had stopped being used as production, and then the Google image is how it looks now. It's been raised and it's just an empty field, but it is still a place, and in my imagination you can still see the factory foundation maybe. Here's the Hamilton manufacturing plant in its glory in the late 19th century. And here are the ruins to the one of Page's factory in Connecticut. I'm mostly going to focus on the Page company for various reasons that I'll talk about, stability being one of them. But this is what the company looks like now. I'm looking for a good drone pilot to help get images of flyovers. So if you know any, let me know. From finding the location of the companies, being able to figure out who the companies were named after, Kelly does a pretty good job of laying the groundwork for most of the major manufacturers. In his narrative, it's fairly minimal in that he equates the person with the name to the company, and basically the implication is they did all the work, which we know isn't true. Just because your name is on the door, there's a whole set of people to do it. But this is Darius Wells. This is John Lomax. We don't have a picture of him, but he was a competitor to Darius Wells for a very short amount of time. He was an English immigrant to the U.S., moved in 1830 with his family, set up shop, started making wood type, and then died of cholera in 1834. So he didn't live very long. His assistant was a Scottish bookbinder that turned the company into bookbindery, and went on and never made wood type again. But still looking, here's a sort of a curious find in a tertiary bit of material that points back to the history of wood type, but without any real physical evidence. It's hard to tell what Lomax was making or how successful he might have been. William Page, who I'll spend a bit of time talking about today, here he had such a big beard I had to give him more room. And this fine gentleman, someday I will dress as well as George Setchell. This is before he shipped out to the army in the Civil War. After the war, he comes back to Connecticut and starts working for Page as well, and ends up running the company. And he and Page are responsible for selling shuttering the company and selling it to Hamilton and moving it west. There we go. So the crux of all that is that we have sort of the dudes, the white dudes that were the top of the food chain, right? That made their names were on the companies, but there's all the folks that worked for them that actually did and made these things. I think Nicola Gray says it best that the typefaces were designed by the anonymous employees of commercial firms supplying commercial printers. And I think anonymous is the key word here. For the longest time, the 19th century, most of the typographic work being produced was seen as other. Slowly it began to, and in some part because of Kelly's work, began to historicize that period and see it in the mainstream. But the rest is kind of left to guessing. So the work that I'm doing is trying to find those people. Page stayed in one town his entire career, in Norwich, Connecticut. So that's a way to sort of control what I'm going to be looking for. He moved around a few times while he was there, and so that generates paperwork on the city level that begins to produce records that can be searched, so we know where he was at different times in the city. Norwich, luckily, was a fairly established commercial center in Connecticut, so they had good bookkeeping. There we go. One of the things is city directories. So I've been able to access the city directory. Let's go back. Sorry, this is sluggish. There we go. The city directory for the city of Norwich. Starting in about 1860, it lists all the people that live in town, their names, their occupations, where they work often by address, and definitely where they lived at home. It's got a mind of its own. There we go. Here highlighted is Carrie Burdick, who is a 19-year-old type cutter for William Page. The other thing in knowing a place and beginning to get names from city directories and beginning to use those job titles as a way to sort of narrow the focus, because Page was the only manufacturer in Norwich, anybody that's listed in the city directories that has anything to do with type can by inference be seen as an employee of Page. I don't think it's such a big leap, and I don't think it's incorrect to make that assumption. There weren't any other type manufacturers nearby where people would have been living in town and commuting. They all would have been living close to the factory, and most of the address information seems to corroborate this. So, in the period that Page was running the company, his employees show up in the city directory. Here's a census record for John Blackman, who we'll talk about in a second. It shows him as being a type cutter in the 1860 federal census. It shows him living with his mother and father and siblings. And then what I've done is begun to compile all that information into a database. So collecting all the names of the people that show up in the city directories. I've moved through about 20 years of material. The problem is while they're now available online, you still have to read them manually. They're not OCR'd in any way to read that information. So I'm slowly reading page by page, word by word, all of the directories. It's fascinating reading, I've got to tell you. But in compiling that work, beginning to really see who was working for the company, and then using genealogical records and secondary things like federal census and military records, beginning to sort of draw these portraits of the people that were doing this work. Here's a small sampling of people. Carrie Burdick was an employee of Page from 1870 to 1871. She was 19 when she started working for Page as a cutter, which was running the pantograph machine, basically. Was taking the makers would make the patterns. There wasn't a lot of drawing in those offices. They tended to go right to pattern, either sort of working them directly in cardboard or a similar material, and then transferring it into the wood pattern. So the makers were sort of the drawers, the designers. The cutters were the manufacturers. They were the ones actually running the machines, Carrie Burdick being one of them. She drops off the map after 1871, and here's sort of the trick with the 19th century, is that there was a strong tradition of when two people were married, the girl gave up her name, and so they're hard to track. It's hard to check where Carrie went after. I'm assuming she either moved out of town and got another job, or she married and changed her name and stayed in Norwich, but I haven't been able to find her. So it's a bit of a trick that I haven't solved. Another person, Wealthy Armstrong, I love Wealthy's name. She lived with her mother and sister her entire life and worked for Page for a substantial portion of that. She started in 1867. Oh my gosh, I've got 2 minutes left. Oh no, I've got to hurry, sorry. So finding people. John Blackman leaves Page and goes to work for another manufacturer in New York, where he patents a typeface, so shows up on the record that way. It's very rare for the actual designer and maker of the type to actually patent the work in the 19th century. It was typically the company and the employer that was named on the patent. So there's a substantial number of patents for wood type in the American patent record, but it's all basically given to the company rather than to the individual. Helen Smith was related to Page. She worked for Page as a finisher and a trimmer, so sort of did all the finishing small work on the wood type, and then moved with the company when it moved out to Hamilton, and then in 1815 she dropped dead while Christmas shopping. So she shows up in the obituary record. So what I really wanted to do in the last minute that I have here is the main work of what I wanted to talk about was connecting people to manufacturers. So the process that I used was to use Page as a case study to narrow down the known specimen records that we have of that, which is about 37 specimen catalogs between and then look specifically at the material that was made between 1860 and 1873, because I have records of people working then. I indexed those catalogs so I know all of the types that were made. I can then tell which types were introduced for the first time in wood type, or that were either borrowed from metal or were fashioned originally. And so here is, for the first time ever, a listing of the people that actually did the work in the company. the makers on top, and you can see by the way that I've configured this is the cycle of the business world, how Page gained in strength, gained employees. He was producing more work, more types, so he had more people working for him. It peaked at about 1870 and then began to diminish all the way out until he sells the company in 1891. But we have very clear set of folks that were working. And the great thing is that it's not just men that are working in it, but it's men and women. Page was really great at employing from all over the community. So we have a nice gender record, at least in that way, that we can begin to work with. So here's a few people called out. I'm 30 seconds over, I'm so sorry. Here's finally, that was the intro, here's the real work. Listing the people, finding the types that were introduced in that particular year so we can combine it with the people, and then seeing the work that's done. And so this is the real work that I've been performing. So we actually, for the first time, can look at these typefaces and say, well, it was Higgins or Hovey or Keyes or Martin or Sherman or Spalding or Tubbs that are real people that had real lives that are connected to those real faces. That it's not all just other, but it's actually something that we can look at very closely. So finally, I'll wrap up by saying the things that need to still be done. The rest of the bibliography needs to be written. The rest of the 10 years that are left need to be cataloged of city directories. I need to finish indexing the specimen record, and then I need to begin to start looking for patterns in the type making to hopefully actually connect single typefaces to single designers. I suspect that there's a way of doing it if I just spend enough time with the material, that there are patterns developed over people's careers so we can see how they were fashioning those letters. So that is that. Thank you.